Hello everyone, happy 4th of July to my American followers. Today we make a patriotic themed video about, in fact, the long rifle of the American War of Independence. For the series I will use a very highly cultured citation here. Celebrate the independence of your country by blowing up part of it. So this is a series that I actually started. This is the first episode of sort of the most iconic weapons in American history, especially as far as more or less the 18th to 19th century is concerned. So I thought to start on July the 4th this year with the famed long rifle, also known as the Kentucky or Pennsylvania rifled musket, that aside from its impressive technical performance, embodies the ethos of the United States military culture. I would say it's really very important for Americans to recover what it means to be military powerful, to break off from isolationism, and understanding that the foundations of greatness lay in force, used not just for the sake of, say, one own's home defense, but also for wielding that God-given power that, when manifest, definitely is a blessing also for those who enjoy the protection of, as I know myself, coming from Western Europe, and this is valid for many other people in the world. I will not be talking about this much, but I made enough American warfare content for you to know, not just American warfare for that matter. My entire channel is. I realize that many people just come across it without any clue whatsoever about what this is all about, but this is also the way you spread further information in the process. But let's get to this weapon. You know that on Schwerpunkt they don't really talk too much about arms per se, even as a medievalist arms, armor, etc. Indeed, however, the technological aspect of warfare is all one with the broader doctrinal, moral, and say that the overall dimension entailed by warfare and its political mandate. So when we look at the long rifle, crafted by European immigrant gunsmiths to meet the unique demands of American pioneers and hunters, it's commonly referred to, in fact, as the long rifle as emerging as a transformative weapon during the War of Independence. It's a bit like the longbow, right? What does long rifle mean? It's simply literally a long rifle. And it's not much about the adjective, but the substantive, of course, that we're looking at, because rifled musket, rifle barrels in general were a thing from a very long time. But as we explained in other videos, for example, about the Napoleonic skirmishers, we're pretty close to that, but we were talking about it for the War of Crimea, or the US Civil War, when rifled muskets were not yet even uniform, like for line infantry, depending on the context, of course. We're looking at a gradual advancement in firearm technology, where the rifled barrel, that, as you know, ensures a much greater range and precision, is something that, while known, had, of course, taken its time to develop in a way that would be cost-benefit effective, right? Preferable. So we have to understand in this case why it had become so popular in the American frontier. The long rifle creation represented a seamless fusion of European artisanal expertise with the practical necessities of the New World, fundamentally reshaping colonial settlement, tactics, and cultural identity as well. A strip of soft iron was painstakingly hand-forged into a rifle barrel, meticulously drilled and rifled with rudimentary tools to create spiral grooves that ensured exceptional ballistic accuracy, a labor-intensive process requiring up to 40 hours per barrel due to the precision needed for consistent rifling. This was happening roughly in the frontier with the means just of sort of regular farmers, of course, gunsmiths specialized in these. In this pretty isolated communities at times, there was also, of course, say a military industry. You can't argue, as we've seen, the same weapons were imported from Europe, but the way they were crafted for the frontier was specifically unique, let's say, calibrated for the precise needs of the colonists. The barrel of the long rifle, often 40-48 inches long, was affixed to a stock expertly carved from a robust, finely grained wood of a maple tree, valued for its strength, durability, and aesthetic appeal as well. Some were works of art. It was all a gentry that, of course, had very elaborated muskets in general, that you can still see in museums next to sort of the more final rank ones, which lent the rifle, however, in that case, speaking of the maple tree stock, both functionality and a distinctive visual character. The rifle was completed with a flintlock mechanism and hammer carefully forged at the anvil to ensure reliable ignition under harsh conditions. This was a critical feature given the flintlock's vulnerability to dampness, right, which could cause misfires in the humid frontier environment. And as we'll learn now, aside from hunting purposes, these weapons had been definitely used for war in pretty intense guerrilla combat, by the way, that we in part illustrated in the video about the British strategy of the 7 Years' War in North America. Also, the video about Canadian warfare, roughly from the League of Augsburg, in fact, to the eve of the American War of Independence. You understand how important it was to rely on your weapon, especially in times where it was, of course, like there were secondary weapons of sort. Frontiersmen were quite resourceful in individual terms, but indeed, these weapons were really so destructively effective in that their reliability was all one with their raison d'être. In a modest artisan workshop, an unnamed gunsmith, likely trained in the sophisticated gun-making traditions of German-speaking regions such as Bavaria or the Palatinate, produced a firearm that not only enabled European settlers to establish a foothold in the vast American continent, but also played a decisive role in their fight for independence from British rule. So there is this Jäger background, as we understand here. It's all about a European background. Was of course, British, French influence, arms, technology, all time. But it seems that especially the German immigrants had something specifically to do with this. The long rifle's influence extended far beyond its immediate utility, redefining colonial expansion and warfare by introducing precision-based individualistic combat that also resonated with the American ethos of self-reliance, that in a sense is all one with the spirit of the revolution, but even more so in these frontier eras that admittedly, and this is a bit unromantic and unedifying, but let's say it's not much like they thought that they were paying too many taxes. Basically, they had never been paying taxes to anyone, and they didn't want to pay, of course, some that would have arrived. Also, they supported the effort of those that could simply push away from the possibility of spreading from the coast this practice as well. They read the Bible, the almanac, not much else really, and they just saw in backing the revolution opportunity to further gain autonomy and advantages on their own. Now, the long rifle's technical innovation allowed settlers to hunt efficiently and defend against threats, while its tactical versatility disrupted, to a degree at least, traditional European military paradigms, especially in the frontier guerrilla warfare, enabling small mobile units to challenge larger disciplined forces. Of course, this is true just as far as this very fringe conditions are concerned. As we were explaining at the beginning, warfare was not ready for a large-scale introduction of rifled barrels, at least not in the way they could supplant the smoothbore for line infantry. That was the gold standard of strategic superiority in open field, right? That would come just later. Nevertheless, again, as far as the context was concerned, these guys, and regardless also of political and military reasons, had developed their own rifles this way. So that the long rifle's significance transcended its physical attributes, becoming even a cultural icon, symbolizing the ingenuity and resilience of the American frontier, and before its eventual spread, like as a tool of war. Its production in small workshops, often by a single craftsman, reflected also the decentralized, resourceful nature of colonial society, where access to industrial resources was limited, especially in the fringe. The rifle's design was tailored to the specific needs of the frontiersmen, also in a sense from a physical point of view, because the Americans were a nation in the making, but its youth was, in fact, largely of this North European descent. They were further selected by the harsh conditions of the frontier itself. So in the moment which we see the rifle employed in combat, we also associate it to sort of robust young men, lean, capable of moving in the woods fast, habituated to the hardships of the wilderness. And that thus reflects in total the roughest face of America. The rifle's design was connected thus with the dense forests of Pennsylvania, as well as the open plains of Kentucky, hence also the attribution roughly of the states, this region's names, making it versatile for survival and warfare alike. Its widespread use during the Revolutionary War fostered a sense of unity among different colonial communities, as settlers from different regions and an ethnic background like Scots-Irish, German, English, and others shared a common reliance on this distinctly American weapon at that point. This often happens. We've seen it in the Middle Ages as well, that, I don't know, the Vosges would be like an emblem of the Swiss. Then maybe it would not be that central anyway, but it sort of came to be part of the icons of the American War of Independence, and later also of the frontier further across North America. This shared reliance helped forge a collective identity, bridging cultural and linguistic divides, and reinforcing the revolutionary cause. At the end of the day, the long rifle's role as a symbol of resistance was further amplified by its depiction in revolutionary propaganda, where it was portrayed as a tool of liberty, embodying the ideals of freedom and self-determination that fueled the American cause. That's how the long rifle emerges as a distinctly American muzzle-loading firearm designed for settlers navigating the expansive and tamed wilderness of the New World that had been theater, by the way, of intense fights between the British, the French, their native allies, to whom the English colonists had participated as you know, as auxiliary forces in pretty unforgiving weather and environment in general, and where settlements and trading posts were often separated by days of arduous travel by foot or horseback. Therefore, arming yourself with this weapon was unitly transcending a mere momentary practicality or some sort of experimental design. Essentially, the long rifle came to be molded with characteristics that were peculiarly fitting to this unique context. Besides, this weapon would enter the frontier folklore itself. There are tales, there is all important literature, stories of marksmen and their trusty rifles, a bit like the alter ego of the warrior, like it was historically in the mists of myth and history in an anthropological sense, killing fierce enemies, whether large brown bears or imperious redcoats. So these tales were passed down through oral traditions, celebrating the fighter, the man, and the American himself. Until the early 18th century, colonial hunters and farmers relied themselves on smooth-bore muskets imported from Great Britain and France, typically .69 to .75 inches, so something like 17.5 to 90 millimeters in caliber, right? And the smooth-bore was effective at close range, but unreliable beyond 100 meters due to its lack of rifling, which caused projectiles to tumble unpredictably. And they required substantial black powder, often 100 to 150 grains per shot, to propel their heavy lead balls weighing between 4 and 500 grains. These muskets were ill-suited for the frontier's dispersed and resource-scarce conditions, where hunters needed to conserve supplies and militiamen faced adversaries employing unconventional tactics. So in many ways, the need to develop further the rifle technology stemmed directly from the heavy pressure put on the colonists by the frontier. You needed a much more reliable and long-ranged musket that could really create sort of a defensive layer around you quite widely enough to put you in pretty safe condition, otherwise unforgiving context. An anonymous gunsmith, so as we were saying before, this were probably a German immigrants of Pennsylvania, we can imagine, recognized these shortcomings and drew on the rifling techniques of the European Jäger hunter rifles, used for, in fact, the Schuss in the German states and prized for their precision. The long rifles, smaller caliber, typically .40 to .50 inches, so something between 10 to 12.7 millimeters compared to the Jäger's .60 inches, 15, was optimized for lighter game, like deer, and reduced powder consumption to 50 to 80 grains per shot, reflecting the economic constraints of colonial life itself. So, of course, initially, it seems that the rifle barrel spread mostly for hunting purposes, because regardless of the frontier raids, actual warfare going on across the 18th century, especially also in the later decades before the American War of Independence, that would be the main purpose of the rifle itself, right? And so this was not needed just to create massive gaps and wounds into a human body for that matter. However, things were to evolve. The German influence was pivotal as Pennsylvania's German-speaking communities, including Moravians and Amish, brought a tradition of meticulous craftsmanship that was refined in the colonies, fostering a localized gun-making culture that prioritized versatility and adaptability. This culture was evident in the establishment of gun-making hubs like Lancaster and Bethlehem, where artisans adopted European techniques to create rifles suited to American terrain and lifestyle. When we look at the psychophysical and sociocultural background of the rifleman, we can appreciate better what was the man behind the rifle, or better, how the rifle was an extension of the same man, as we've seen in his alter ego in hunt and in combat, that psychomachically speaking is the same concept in tradition, right? The rifleman who wielded the long rifled musket could be diverse, yet a cohesive group primarily drawn from the frontier's rugged communities. Physically, they were hardened by the demands of frontier life, clearing dense forests, hunting elusive game, and traversing treacherous terrain on foot or horseback. These activities endowed them with exceptional endurance, strength, and agility, with many possessing lean, muscular builds suited for carrying heavy loads, including the 3 to 5 kilos long rifle, powder horns, and ammo over long distances. I would like to stress that normally more than 3.5 kilos in combat is prohibitive for most weapons. So if you have to wield these giant guns for the time being, as we will see now, that they could arrive up to 180 centimeters. They were essentially as tall as the riflemen. You had to have developed consistent physique. Again, in frontier warfare, there is a much more scattered need for gunners. They operate often with tactics and techniques that elude the typical linear warfare that has been fully consolidating on European battlefields. And it's even more striking in this sense that agility was required, meaning that as heavy as these guns could be, they were also designed for that kind of swift movement. So this basically equates to a level of quasi-athleticism in order to be able to use these guns. Naturally, as we will understand now, there was no such thing like standardization. So of course, there were also smaller models for all, tastes and needs. Nevertheless, when you look at the specific use during the American War of Independence, you really realize that the men chosen as among the long riflemen were really elite sharpshooters in many psychophysical ways. Their marksmanship skills were honed through years of hunting, where precision was critical for survival, as a missed shot could mean starvation or vulnerability to attack. The physical act of loading and firing the long rifle required dexterity and stamina, as process involved measuring powder, patching the bullet, and ramming it down the barrel, often while kneeling or lying prone in combat. So I described in linear tactics videos the crazed moment that, especially in collective formation, musketry fire, the repetition of volleys really consisted in. In a sense, here it's even more frenetic, because even though there is less noise, like there is more scattered combat, still you are one target. Right, and the enemy can, if equipped, say, with with your same weapon, can basically take you down more individually. And so everything is much more dynamic. We've seen it also again in the Chasseurs, the Napoleonic era videos, how important that it would become to harass the infantry, the line infantry, and in this sense, how actually, these rifles were the most punching weapon, but being taken more to reload brought these men to be light infantry, because they had to withdraw at the advance of the more compact, smooth-bore musketeers that would have overwhelmed them by concentrated fire, right? So it's a bit of a paradox, because normally lighter troops have lighter weapons. Instead, in this case of firearms technology, it's in doctrine of, say, modern contemporary warfare, is a bit like the other way around. In any case, it takes nerves, all right? It takes a lot of self-control, and especially knowing what you're doing with the whole thing. And again, ammo is not infinite. The options out there are not infinite, as your life is only one, right? And even a stupid wound at that time could actually take you to the grave. So out of infection, you don't have to be kidding with the whole situation. Riflemen were typically of medium to tall stature, as the rifle's length from 135-180 centimeters typically was tailored to the user's height for ease of loading. Just like, again, medieval long bowmen were normally used by longer men, all right? And so was the long rifle. So crafted, customized on the basis of the rifleman himself, physically wise, ensuring in this sense the barrel did not extend beyond the chin. That was normally the measure when held vertically, because this favored much better sort of a much better control, both of the loading process, of the capacity to look at the enemy, to remain at the same time, so that your eyes are above the gun and you can still sort of almost point him, even though the gun is held vertically, and you can remain focused on the enemy in front of you and seeing all what's going on. There were, of course, also other ergonomic aspects that they would have been able to sort of, if not explained by word, because imagine what a person born and raised in the frontier really was like. The British would find that out the hard way in the Appalachians, exactly in those kind of ambushes enacted by these bear men of some sort. But again, in fact, showing it, right, and showing it to their enemies in that way as well, right? Again, peripheral theaters, but in that case, the redcoats had to pull out of it because it was taking too much of a toll. And by the way, that some of those communities up to the 20th century had held very, anti-social, anti-civilizational, anti-federal mentality, and they literally, the U.S. Forces took literally the air power to curb during the famous strikes at the beginning of the 20th century to put them relatively down. It was actually a negotiation there, but lots of U.S. military men died in the process as well. So there is a legacy there in basically some radical imagination and alienation, but still preserved independence of some sort. And so psychologically, the riflemen were characterized by this fierce independence and resilience, shaped by the constant threats of the frontier, including encounters with bears, wolves, and hostile Indian tribesmen. This environment fostered a mindset of self-reliance, quick decision-making, and adaptability, especially the quasi-non-existent consideration for human life, qualities that translated, of course, into their effectiveness as sharpshooters. In many ways, they lived in an incredibly archaic, primitive, and brutal reality that was, however, the best in its traumatically violent romance, to be the best sort of killer out there. Scalp takers, skinners of all sorts, right? There's a beautiful aspect, actually, of colonial warfare. We could make a video about the French coureurs de bois in Canada and more, because again, there were similar things in Europe, especially on the eastern frontier. Think about the Cossacks, there are some that was like the Wild East as opposed to the Wild West. But we will definitely make this kind of comparisons at some point on the channel. And the long rifleman mental toughness was bolstered by a deep familiarity with the wilderness, which required acute situational awareness, the ability to remain calm under pressure, whether stalking game or engaging enemies. So again, also sensorial experience that today, in a broader existential sense, we can't but dream of. The riflemen's confidence in their marksmanship was a source of pride as well, often reinforced by community competitions. As we know, since the Middle Ages, the normal deal for the militia was to be surveyed, and there were, during festivals, games that prompted these men to demonstrate their skills, such as shooting at targets carved into trees or splitting bullets on axe blades, a practice that became part of frontier lore. Socio-culturally, the riflemen were a mix of ethnicities, predominantly Scots-Irish and German, with the smaller numbers of English, Welsh, and other European settlers. The Scots-Irish, often from Ulster, brought a martial tradition rooted in their history of border conflicts in Ireland. I made a video about the Earldom of Ulster, if you're interested in that. Again, it's one of the most brutal realities you can imagine from centuries. So they were people that were passing from a fringe to another in many ways, both socially and geographically, coupled with a deep-seated distrust of centralized authority. Again, these men were not particularly sensitive to, I don't know, what generally speaking, the founding fathers, other than some sort of specific core principles, and again, in social cultural terms, would have represented, right? These people kept living into a world of their own that, in a sense, went past even what was actually happening with the American War of Independence, the United States and all, and that really exemplifies some of the most vivid, and in the sense paradoxical, identities of the American nation. This surely, in some circumstances, had fueled their revolutionary zeal as well. German immigrants, particularly from the Palatinate, contributed technical expertise and strong work ethic, often settling in tight-knit communities in Pennsylvania and the Shenandoah Valley. Their lifestyle was one of subsistence farming, hunting, and trapping, with many in log cabins or small homesteads surrounded by clear fields and dense forests. Socially, they were bound by a frontier code of mutual support where community defense and shared labor were paramount, as neighbors often banded together to repel raids or build fortifications. There was a general mob culture. There was a general condition of misery, especially in their past memory in the old continent. These guys had moved here from areas that were, or at least from social conditions, were depressed enough to seek fortune in this unforgiving theater across the Atlantic. Culturally, the riflemen valued the long rifle not only as a tool but as a symbol of their identity, often personalizing their rifles with carved initials or decorative inlays and passing them down as heirlooms through generations. This is really typical of the era, and especially in this poorer context. This tells you also how reliable over time the weapons themselves were. The long rifleman's lack of formal military training was, as militiamen, offset by practical experience in frontier skirmishes, where they developed an intuitive understanding of terrain and guerrilla tactics, making them ideally suited for their weapons' capabilities. This aspect is relevant because, as we explained before, the regulars were really and intrinsically, and given the structure of the armies of the time, superior to militia, to auxiliaries. But again, we do know, also considering how sort of effective these weapons were, that in fact they weren't particularly different from the rest of the muskets, and so the effects could be similar. And it's important to stress because, honestly, even for finding adequate pictures of the long rifles, it took some more refined search, because in many ways they were similar to the arm musket. It takes some sort of experience to be able to recognize the rifle as opposed to the regular smooth bore, as they really looked similar, and these weapons altogether came out again in different sizes at the time. So it isn't quite simply about an extremely specific shape or a very categorical size, or something you can immediately just claim to be, okay, that's one of them. Okay, if you are particularly experienced in the field, yes, but otherwise, and also in strict concrete terms on the battlefield, the difference is not going to be that immediately straightforward. So that even, as we will see now, the specialized units of long riflemen acting as properly some elite forces on the battlefields of the American War of Independence were still very select sharp shooters, also equipped with some of the finest rifles. Not talking much of a brand quality, but again that quality that just the experienced long riflemen would have been able to exalt and translate into a massacre in combat. Now, this experience was rooted in decades, as we've seen, also de facto warfare, frontier raids with the native Indian tribes, where small unit tactics and marksmanship were critical for survival. Also, because of the tendential lack of more cohesive firepower. Yes, militias were communally trained to fight in linear tactics, but aside from the fact that the smaller the units, tendentially, the more effective and more archaic primitive weapons, like literally bows and arrows, tomahawks, etc. But also trickier the situation is against a more attritional type of warfare, against guerrilla, for example. So yes, that way of concentrating firepower through orderly, regular volleys, one after the other, was the best way to go. But only if you had an enemy that fought in front of you in ways that would allow it, which does not mean that also from the other side you simply elude those tactics, because again, where the militia walks, especially in open ground, and you can't deliver that firepower, there's also the greatest amount of wealth. Settlements are the center of these fertile expanses and so on. But of course, if you wanted to carry out a retaliatory raid, a night attack, some infiltration action, well, you had to be ready for more individual forms of combat that included still firearms, of course, and that's where the long rifle was actually a pretty good tool, so to say. The rifleman's lifestyle was often nomadic and demanding, often requiring them to spend weeks or months in the wilderness, tracking game or scouting for threats for their own communities, and making bad encounters against people that could be as insidious as them, that could teach so many sort of tricks, the terrain exploitation, and more. So there was really a unique experience gained by these men on very specific terrain in particular. For this reason, the long riflemen were skilled, for example, in bushcraft, capable of constructing shelters, navigating by the stars, and surviving on minimal provisions. Right? Their diet was sparse, consisting of cornmeal, dried meat, and foraged plants supplemented by game hunted naturally with the long rifle. Socially, the long riflemen formed tight-knit communities where storytelling, music, and marksmanship contests strengthened bonds. Their cultural practices, such as barn raisings and communal hunts, reinforce a sense of collective identity with their shared use of the musket in both daily life and warfare, creating a unifying thread across diverse backgrounds. The riflemen's rugged individualism, combined with their communal loyalty, made them formidable fighters, and their psychophysical resilience and social-cultural cohesion enabled them to adapt to this fluid and unpredictable nature of revolutionary warfare. Hunters, particularly fur trappers and those supplementing largely vegetarian diets with game, needed firearms with greater accuracy and range, using lighter projectiles, from 100 to 200 grains that consumed less black powder. This enabled them to carry sufficient ammo, often 50 to 100 rounds compared to 20 to 30 for muskets, and powder on extended expeditions without excessive weight, a critical consideration in the wilderness where resupply was rare. The long rifle's design incorporated a patch, a greased cloth wrapped around the bullet to ensure a tight fit in the rifled barrel. That's how unsophisticated technology really was at the time, but again, already the barreling was crucial, enhancing accuracy and reducing fouling, a technical advancement that improved the reliability during prolonged use as well. The aforementioned patch, typically made of linen or leather, was lubricated with animal fat or beeswax, allowing the bullet to engage the rifling while minimizing residue buildup, which was essential for maintaining accuracy during extended engagements. In particular, for militiamen, the smoothbore musket designed for the massed volley fire tactics of 18th century European warfare was ineffective. Unlike disciplined European soldiers, American militiamen, shaped by their independent spirit and lack of formal training, favored individual skirmish-style combat, especially against elusive Indian adversaries who employed hit-and-run tactics honed over decades of frontier warfare. This aspect is very important because from one side, of course, you have this ill-trained militia that doesn't have much of a consistency in open field. Much of the minutemen thing is also connected in part to this. Like, you fire a few shots, then you withdraw, because even in your battlefield sustainability, you are actually limited, right? In more favorable terrain, you can, however, if the regulars are foolish enough to enter forested, rugged terrain, etc., to ambush them in the process. Equally, however, your guns, these rifles that are sort of more effective than the muskets for hitting like more rapid targets, etc. Also, long ranges are ideal to fight against, again, lighter enemies than yours that will flee when you are there. The long rifle's design was, let's say, addressing all these general needs, featuring a small caliber barrel, sometimes as small as 0.24 to 0.28 inches, so from 6 to 7 millimeters, with a long rifled barrel, typically 40-48 inches, that significantly enhance long-distance accuracy. This spiral rifling with a twist rate of one turn in 48 to 66 inches imparted a stabilizing spin to the projectile, improving ballistic stability and extending effective range to over 200 meters, a capability unmatched by contemporary muskets. A skilled marksman could strike a target at this distance, transforming frontier warfare. In 1778, during the siege of Boonesborough, frontiersman Daniel Boone fatally shot a British officer at nearly 230 meters, a feat that showcased the rifle's precision and psychological impact, unnerving British forces unaccustomed to such long-range threats, and codifying an American tradition of irregular warfare. The long rifle's tactical significance was amplified by its use in specific combat roles. Its accuracy allowed riflemen to target high-value enemies such as officers or artillery crews from concealed positions, disrupting British command structures and morale. Naturally, you had to be adequately placed because, again, you can't quite simply cope against the dominating tactics of the time, in as much as they are the best. That ensures that, say, an army of long riflemen cannot hold against those smooth-bore regulars, right? So even though this precision-based approach contrasted sharply with the European reliance on massed infantry volleys, it's not until the mid-19th century that you have it applicable to regulars, in fact, gradually transforming, especially in the following decades, the battlefields, like properly scattering the troops. Also machine guns from what you could describe as a full battlefield with massed troops, right? What basically warfare had always been. And again, the colonists themselves had been relying on this tactics of massed infantry volleys. However, again, in the various niches of the colonial battlefields, British commanders were at times forced to adapt by deploying light infantry and, interestingly enough, given the the German immigrant sort of kind of origin of the long rifle, likely, Hessian Jägers to counter American sharpshooters. Right, so basically the same kind of philosophy. The long rifle's effectiveness in wooded terrain where cover was abundant gave American forces a tactical advantage in such circumstances, enabling them to dictate the terms of engagement. This is the case, for example, of the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780, where riflemen's accurate fire from elevated positions decimated British loyalist forces. In such cases, the riflemen's physical conditioning and familiarity with the terrain allowed them to maneuver swiftly, often outpacing British troops encumbered by heavy uniforms and equipment. Their ability to fire and reload while moving through dense forests or rocky hillsides made them elusive targets, further amplifying the long rifle's tactical impact. How much did the long rifle enhance firepower, and how efficient was this weapon? So the long rifle's small caliber bullets occupied less space, as we've seen, allowing hunters and soldiers to carry significantly more ammo for the same weight, a vital advantage in the resource-scarce frontier. But even more in certain circumstances during prolonged engagements in open field, where you could have these sharpshooters working a bit more from a physical point of view, but actually inflicting per man more damage to massed, musketeers formation. Again, if they were properly employed. A typical loadout included lead balls, patches, and powder horns sufficient for weeks in the wilderness, with powder consumption 50-80 grains per shot, halved compared to muskets that would have required 150 grains. The principle that powder expands eightfold in volume upon ignition further enhanced efficiency, enabling sustained operations without frequently resupply. The small caliber allowed reboring and re-rifling when the barrel's interior wore down, extending the weapon's service life despite slightly increasing the caliber, a practice critical in frontier communities far from industrial hubs. The long rifle's reloading time, approximately 30 seconds compared to 20 seconds for a smoothbore musket. You understand there why, again, they could not be competitive in open field, was a drawback indeed, but this was mitigated for marksmen firing from concealed long-range positions in wooded or rugged terrain where they were less vulnerable. In order for smoothbore musketeers to engage such single targets, would have been really a waste of ammo, of an important deflection of more, open field expendable resources. Let's put it in this way. And so that's always the contrast that we studied in von Clausewitz quite well from a theoretical point of view of, again, the very often the good enough but the bigger, in this sense, dominates the more strategically relevant theaters, whereas the more pressured fringe element maybe increases individual quality but cannot cope with that, and it remains in the fringe exactly because of that. And that's why, again, you need continental regulars at such to, and also the same militias, but properly integrated into a bigger force to take on the redcoats in open field. Now, the use of pre-measured powder charges, often stored in hollowed-out antler tips, and patched bullets streamlined reloading under combat conditions, reducing the time gap with muskets. The rifle's length, typically, as we've seen, 135 to 180 centimeters. So again, some of these men were real giants because they could be, for the time standards, people were, as you know, generally shorter. And if 180 is at your chin, basically you are more than 190, almost 2 meters in height, and 3 to 5 kilos in weight, which, as we've seen, for a sharpshooter, a lighter rifleman really means a lot of physical strains that he would have had the physicality, in fact, to sustain. While the long rifle was less maneuverable than shorter muskets, 32, 39 inches, to give an average range, its length enhanced its sleek aesthetic, refined by gunsmiths for discerning clients, as we were recalling before, reflecting a cultural appreciation for craftsmanship that blended utility with artistry even, and there was some sort of psychological effect in wielding these weapons in their beautiful silhouettes and decorations as well. Early long rifles were functional, but for mid-18th century aesthetic embellishments, brass or silver inlays, carved stocks with motifs like acorns, scrolls, or hunting scenes became common. In fact, that's what you can mostly find later on, because the long rifle has a tradition later on. And as we've seen, by the 18th century was relatively novel, right, as a weapon type, developing specifically for the frontier environment, starting from hunting context in some more brutal direction, such as the one enforced by the North American frontier. However, the iconic meaning that the long rifle achieved, especially during the American War of Independence, will reflect in this robust, sturdy American and as unyielding American spirit, would bring many also more comfortably living individuals to want such symbols of Americanism, and transforming the rifle into a personalized work of art, celebrating the glory of the weapon itself in such historical setting. A gunsmith required skills in blacksmithing, metalwork, woodworking, carving, and engraving, often working alone to craft the entire rifle, tailored to client specifications. Unlike European craftsmen who were specialized in anticipation of industrialization, and so, as you know, much more compressed and large-scaled, as conventional, so to say, or regular, better even, military context, the North American frontier gunsmiths remained versatile, producing both metal and wooden components. Initially, flintlock mechanisms were imported from Britain, but the War of Independence disrupted trade, necessitating domestic production in centers like the aforementioned Lancaster and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania by the 70s of the 18th century. As soon as the war broke out, these workshops used locally sourced materials such as the aforementioned maple, wood, and iron from colonial forges, fostering economic self-sufficiency as a proto-national identity, providing also with the basis for some important weaponry production in different parts of the rebelling colonies. The long rifle gentry's ornate designs served as status symbols, with wealthier settlers commissioning intricate inlays to signify social standing, while simpler versions were prized by ordinary frontiersmen for their reliability. Culturally, the long rifle became a potent symbol of the American frontier, celebrated in oral traditions, early American literature, and even sermons, because indeed the sacred weapons were always there in Western tradition. In fact, the gun was portrayed as a tool of divine providence, the American manifest destiny, embodying the rugged individualism that defined the colonial experience, but say the reliance on rudimentary but still effective means that went along well with the puritanic stern morality. During the American Revolution, the long rifle was the weapon of choice for the minutemen, militiamen ready to mobilize instantly, and sharpshooter units enabling targeted strikes on British officers and disrupting formations. In battles like Coburn's 1781, the riflemen's physical and mental resilience, honed by their frontier lifestyle, allowed them to exploit their weapons' capabilities fully, moving quickly through rough terrain and maintaining accuracy under pressure. The long rifle's legacy extended beyond the American War of Independence, influencing the design of later national firearms, such as the 19th century Springfield rifles. So, of course, we will have to give adequate space in Schwerpunkt, and shaping the national narrative of self-reliance and innovation. The long rifle impact was also felt in the post-war westward expansion, of course, as the frontier was expanding, as it remained a vital tool for settlers and explorers pushing into the Ohio Valley and beyond. A very important mention has to be made for Morgan's sharpshooters. In 1775, Daniel Morgan formed a 40-man light infantry company, recruiting only skilled marksmen via a test, hitting an 18-centimeter target twice at 190 meters. Quite selective, but when you get men capable of doing this, you can rely on their marksmanship in combat. The company expanded to 80 men and 16 officers trained to maintain precision while moving rapidly, a tactic, as we've seen, devastating to British forces unaccustomed to this intensity of mobile sharpshooting. Their life of constant vigilance and self-sufficient translated into a psychological edge, allowing them to remain composed in chaotic skirmishes. Morgan's successes led to his promotion to colonel and command of the 11th Virginia Regiment, uniting the Army's finest marksmen of the war. His 500 men were instrumental at the Battle of Saratoga, fought on September the 19th and October the 7th, 1777, preventing the Indian scouts from monitoring American movements, securing a turning point in the engagement that, by the way, also won French support. The riflemen's mobile, accurate fire prefigured also the most specialized guerrilla warfare, in a sense, while their success elevated the same long rifle's reputation, inspiring its adoption across militias. At battles like Freeman's Farm, part of the Saratoga campaign, Morgan's riflemen targeted British officers with devastating effect, disrupting command and contributing to the eventual final British surrender. Their physical prowess, cultural cohesion, and tactical acumen, combined with the long rifle's precision, made them a formidable force in battles like just the last, proving like how much damage could be inflicted on an enemy to win essentially a Pyrrhic victory for him. And this that's why the long rifle. I think I wanted to dedicate this video to it as it really shaped the American War of Independence in some ways that, say, worked in the lower aspect of the mechanism. And it also shaped America's emerging identity as a nation forged through ingenuity and resistance. And the value of resistance is definitely the one that, as I said at the beginning of the video, should be better appreciated in the ways can be seen, like countries adapt to even the direst of circumstances just to survive, just to make a stand and demonstrate that they are there, they are felt, they're not somebody else's. And again, I think that Americans must really study much better. If anything, simply coming back on their history. This is valid for anyone, really, but we all know to which abyss of ignorance the world has sunk. And just looking back at these bloody but still glorious victory pages, we can better understand what's the role and action of each of us in the world needed to really shape it, hopefully to the best, right, of our beliefs. And this is what is in fact the most important part of it all, realizing that war is not just an end to itself. It is stemming from very precise realities that have nothing to do with how much you have to pay for say, weapons, right? But what kind of human dignity you still can claim to have, in as much as you participate to the right. And this is, in many ways, the bottom line for today. Again, I especially like for the sake of the American festivity, I wish all my US followers the best 4th of July. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.